One of the main goals of any form of media is to entrance the viewer into the suspension of disbelief. To make an audience momentarily drop rational thinking and dive headfirst into an alternate reality. One in which actors become characters and sets become scenes. One of the main contributing factors to this effect is world building, and I have never seen a better example of world building than in The Witcher. The Witcher is a story set in a dark Slavic fairy tale. It was originally written in the early 90s for a Polish audience by Andrzej Sapkowski, but it was only relatively recently that Netflix showed an interest in the series, the first season of which was a direct adaptation based on The Last Wish. Both of these examples are passive mediums. Books and films tell you their stories in a very consistent manner, where every viewer might have their own opinions, but will ultimately all have had the same experience. To compare an active medium is, as the name would suggest, something that the audience actively participates in.
Monster's no threat. No need to kill it.
The Wild Hunt was one of the more popular additions to the video game series of The Witcher, but unlike the Netflix series, it wasn't just based on one book. As the game was not intending to give an exact retelling of any specific story, but instead just referencing the material where possible, it gave the writers far more breathing room, and as the story is now set in a video game, it also allowed them to use one of the strongest narrative advantages that games have over the other forms of media, this being environmental storytelling. The Wild Hunt is what I would call the prime example for environmental storytelling. As the game revolves around tracking down monsters and not necessarily killing them, environmental storytelling takes center stage and is built into the very core mechanics of the game. The very first quest that you're given is to hunt down the Griffin of White Orchard, a monster that's only recently been causing chaos for the locals. As you progress through the quest, you learn from the clues left around that it's only been attacking the locals as a form of revenge. The Griffin had been living peacefully in the wilderness before its partner was killed in their sleep by the very soldiers who paid you to kill the creature in the first place. After putting the monster down, this leads to the player finally presenting the Griffin's head to the soldiers as proof of your success, but one that ultimately feels hollow and almost tragic. This quest at first seems to be an introduction to the game's mechanics, but in reality, it's also shown the audience the attitude the game takes towards the idea of monsters and men, and how interchangeable the terms can be.
Wolves hunt to fill their bellies. Wild dogs kill for sport.
Just like humans.
Aye, they've learned much from us. Why not cruelty too?
What's interesting about this is that you don't necessarily need to find this information out. Exploring the nest is a completely optional step, and you wouldn't find this context without it. This gives a completely different perspective on the events, and one that would be nearly impossible for film or text to portray. This is just part of having your story in an active medium, rather than a passive one. An audience can come out of the experience with a completely different perspective of their own individual story. Because of this, this concept is commonly referred to as a branching storyline. Branching storylines are massively expanded upon through the main narrative, and eventually to the later two chapters of the game. In fact, both the Wild Hunt's additional chapters revolve around these same themes too: misdirection, manipulation, and the subversion of expectations.
Sienna gave me a drawing today.
Charming.
Of freshly decapitated bodies covered in blood.
Perhaps not so much.
Both of these stories were specifically about manipulation. Blood and Wine in particular was themed heavily around vampires, monsters that specialize at remaining hidden in plain sight. There's even literal story worlds within both of these chapters. Iris von Everett's painted world, an illustrated limbo fabricated by her own imagination, filled with the memories of her past and plagued by her nightmares. And to contrast this, there's the Land of a Thousand Fables, a hyper-saturated fairy tale world deceivingly based off the Brothers Grimm variant of the folklore. Both of these worlds manage to reveal their secrets to the player almost entirely through their use of environment. Although, unlike the Griffin, this is pretty late into the game, and to get this far requires an awful lot of time.
Oi, wait your looks. Use the look of a man who knows how.
Show off.
Of course I am. Wouldn't you be? Time's a marvelous plaything.
If you were to watch Netflix's first season of The Witcher, the entire experience would take you around 8 hours, giving you only so long to attach yourself to certain characters. The Wild Hunt, on the other hand, is a game that takes on average 50 hours to complete the main story alone, never mind the additional 2 chapters.
What do you mean, time? An ingredient?
Time gives the proper consistency. Time provides that ideal crunch on the outside, the delicious moistness within.
Time adds character. And to show this, I'm going to have to mention parasocial interaction. The idea behind it is that your mind, after so much exposure to certain characters, will create an illusion and subconsciously perceive them as real, thus giving a very real emotional attachment to them. This is completely dependent on the amount of time that you've been subjected to these characters for, and it's one of the game's strongest advantages in both building its narrative and making their characters feel real.
I can't believe you fell for that!
This franchise has a continuing motif of illusions. You can tell from the first episode of the series. There are literal illusions, for example Stregobor's paradise on top of his tower, but also metaphorical ones, such as the continuing subversion of expectations. The more you interact with this franchise, the more you realize that nothing in this world is ever really what it first appears to be.
Appearances, Geralt. Appearances, like mamoons and dopplers, deceive.
In Blood and Wine, one of the first things you're asked to do is to catch a unicorn. This later turns out to be nothing more than a horse with a disappointing headdress. Across the franchise, there are princesses who turn out to be monsters, whereas Geralt the Mutant is anything but one. So I feel in keeping with the theme, when it comes to creating the story world, in both the books and the series, the illusion is certainly there, but it's never anything more. So why is it that I think that video games are the best format for making these worlds? Through an active medium, it leads to one in which you don't just see or read about, but a world that you can actually interact with, explore and immerse yourself in. And I think this is why games are so good at this. Maybe it's because of the unique ways that they can tell their stories. Maybe it's because of how easy it is to become attached to their characters. And maybe it's because fooling your audience into thinking your story world is reality is no longer just simply about maintaining the illusion. And maybe it's about making it tangible instead.